The suburban neighborhood of Willow Creek Estates had always been the kind of place where nothing interesting ever happened. Tree-lined streets, stretched in perfect symmetry, lawns maintained at precisely 2.5 inches, and every mailbox painted in one of three HOA-approved colors. It was the sort of community where the most exciting event of the month was usually someone putting out their trash cans 12 hours too early. That mundane existence was about to be shattered in the most unexpected way possible. Marcus Thompson had moved into his modest 3-bedroom ranch house 6 months earlier, fresh from a bitter divorce that had left him seeking peace and quiet. At 38 years old, he worked remotely as a software engineer, which meant his home internet connection wasn't just a convenience, it was his lifeline to employment. His little corner lot property at the end of Magnolia Drive seemed perfect, away from the busier streets, backing up to a small wooded area, and just far enough from the neighborhood busybodies to maintain some semblance of privacy. Or so he thought. Marcus had noticed Linda Pemberton almost immediately upon moving in. She was impossible to miss. A woman in her early 50s with an overly styled blonde bob that looked shellacked into place. Linda served as the HOA president and took her position with the seriousness of a 4-star general commanding troops. She drove a white Lexus SUV with a license plate that read Hoquen, and she patrolled the neighborhood at least twice daily, clipboard in hand, documenting every possible violation with the dedication of a parking enforcement officer on commission. The first interaction between Marcus and Linda had been civil enough. She had appeared at his door 3 days after he moved in, holding a 3-ring binder that was at least 4 inches thick. She had welcomed him to the neighborhood with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, and proceeded to spend 45 minutes explaining the HOA rules and regulations. There were rules about everything: when Christmas lights could go up and when they had to come down, what type of flowers were acceptable in front gardens, the exact shade of white required for any exterior paint, and a bizarre restriction on decorative rocks larger than 6 inches in diameter. Marcus had nodded politely, signed the acknowledgement form, and assumed that would be the end of it. He kept his lawn mowed, his house maintained, and minded his own business. He didn't realize that, for someone like Linda Pemberton, minding your own business was itself a suspicious activity. The Wi-Fi incident began on a Tuesday morning in late September. Marcus had been experiencing connectivity issues for weeks. His internet would drop randomly, his video calls would freeze at the worst possible moments, and his download speeds had become frustratingly slow. After multiple calls to his internet service provider and a technician visit that solved nothing, Marcus decided to upgrade his router and change his Wi-Fi network name and password. He had been using the default network name that came with his old router, something generic like NETGEAR5G2847. When setting up his new system, Marcus decided to have a bit of fun with it. He was a Star Wars fan, so he named his new network That's No Moon, with a password equally nerdy and secure. He thought nothing of it as he reconfigured all his devices to connect to the new network. What Marcus didn't know was that Linda Pemberton had been connecting to his Wi-Fi network for the past 5 months. The discovery happened purely by accident. 2 days after Marcus changed his network credentials, he noticed Linda's car parked in his driveway when he came back from a grocery run. She was sitting in the driver's seat, engine running, staring intently at her phone. When she noticed Marcus pulling up, she quickly reversed out and drove away without a word. It was odd, but Marcus shrugged it off as another quirk of his eccentric HOA president. The next day, Linda showed up at his door. Her usual forced pleasantness had been replaced with barely concealed irritation. She asked if Marcus had been having problems with his internet. He confirmed that he had, but that he had resolved the issues by upgrading his equipment. Linda's expression had tightened. She asked if he had changed his network name. Marcus, confused by the question, said yes. Linda had stood there for a long moment, her jaw working as if she were chewing on words she couldn't quite spit out. Finally, she had said something about neighborhood network interference and stomped back to her house across the street. Marcus had found the interaction strange but didn't give it much thought until later that evening when he was reviewing his new router's security logs. The advanced router he had purchased included detailed tracking of all devices that had ever connected to the network. That's when he saw it. For the past 5 months, a device labeled Linda the First, Phone 1-2, had been regularly connecting to his old Wi-Fi network. The realization hit him like a freight train. Linda had somehow obtained his Wi-Fi password and had been stealing his internet. The connectivity issues he'd been experiencing suddenly made sense. Linda had likely been using his connection for bandwidth-heavy activities, streaming video or downloading large files. She had been piggybacking off his internet service, and he had been paying for it. Marcus felt violated. His home network wasn't just for entertainment, it contained his work files, personal information, and private data. Someone having unauthorized access to his network was a serious security breach. He considered confronting Linda directly, but decided against it. If she had been brazen enough to steal his Wi-Fi, there was no telling how she might react to being called out. Instead, Marcus decided to document everything and report it to the HOA board. He took screenshots of his router logs, showing Linda's device connecting to his network repeatedly over several months. He documented the dates, times, and amount of data transferred. The evidence was damning and irrefutable. What happened next exceeded Marcus's wildest expectations for sheer absurdity. 3 days after Marcus discovered the Wi-Fi theft, he was working in his home office when he heard sirens approaching. Multiple sirens. He looked out his window to see 2 police cruisers, lights flashing, pulling up in front of his house. His heart rate spiked as he watched 2 officers exit their vehicles and approach his front door. Marcus opened the door before they could knock, his mind racing through possibilities. Had there been a break-in? Was there an emergency in the neighborhood? The officers, a stern-looking male officer in his 40s and a younger female officer, asked to speak with him about an emergency call that had originated from his address. Marcus was baffled. He hadn't called 911. He hadn't called anyone. The officers explained that they had received a frantic emergency call about 15 minutes earlier from this address, claiming that someone was actively breaking into the home and the caller was hiding in a closet. The call had been placed from a cell phone registered to this address. The pieces began clicking into place in Marcus's mind, but the situation was so ridiculous he could barely process it. He explained to the officers that he lived alone, no one was breaking in, and he definitely hadn't made any emergency call. He showed them his cell phone's call log to prove he hadn't dialed 911. The officers seemed confused, but relieved that there was no actual emergency. That's when Marcus noticed Linda Pemberton standing on her front porch across the street, arms crossed, watching the scene with barely concealed satisfaction. A terrible suspicion formed in his mind. He asked the officers if they could tell him what phone number the 911 call had come from. After some hesitation and a few radio calls back to dispatch, they confirmed that the call had come from a number that was not Marcus's. Something had gone wrong with the location services, and the call had been traced to his address instead of wherever it actually originated from. Marcus took a calculated risk. He told the officers about the Wi-Fi theft and suggested that perhaps someone had been spoofing or hijacking his internet connection. The female officer's expression shifted from confusion to interest. She asked Marcus to explain in more detail. Over the next 20 minutes, standing on his front porch, Marcus walked through the timeline. He showed the officers the router logs on his laptop, demonstrating that Linda Pemberton's device had been accessing his network without permission for months. He explained how he had changed his Wi-Fi credentials just days ago. He pointed out Linda watching from across the street and mentioned her strange behavior and visit after he changed his network. The male officer's expression had grown increasingly serious as Marcus explained the situation. Unauthorized access to a computer network, he noted, was a federal crime. The officers asked if Marcus wanted to file a formal complaint. Marcus hesitated. He didn't want to escalate things to that level, but before he could answer, Linda Pemberton made the decision for him. She came storming across the street, her face flushed with anger, and demanded to know why the police were still at Marcus's house when there was clearly an emergency somewhere in the neighborhood. Her aggressive approach and demanding tone immediately put the officers on alert. The female officer calmly explained that they were investigating a suspicious 911 call and asked Linda if she had any information about it. Linda's response was to launch into a tirade about Marcus being a problematic neighbor who didn't respect HOA rules, who had changed his Wi-Fi network without notifying anyone, and who was clearly trying to cause trouble in an otherwise peaceful neighborhood. Her rant was so unhinged and off-topic that both officers exchanged glances. The male officer, his patience clearly wearing thin, asked Linda directly if she had made a 911 call that day. Linda's face went through a series of expressions: indignation, confusion, and then something that looked almost like panic. She insisted she had every right to call emergency services if she suspected something suspicious was happening in the neighborhood. She claimed she had heard strange noises coming from Marcus's house and was concerned for community safety. The female officer's tone sharpened. She informed Linda that filing a false police report was a crime and that misusing emergency services was taken very seriously. Linda backpedaled, insisting she had genuinely believed there was an emergency. But her story kept changing. First, she heard noises. Then she saw suspicious activity. Then she was just being a concerned neighbor. Each version contradicted the last. Then Linda made her fatal mistake. In her increasingly frantic justification for calling 911, she mentioned that she couldn't check the neighborhood security camera footage because her internet wasn't working, and she had been forced to use someone else's connection. And that's when she noticed suspicious activity at Marcus's house. The admission hung in the air like a confession at a murder trial. The male officer asked Linda to clarify what she meant by using someone else's connection. Linda seemed to realize her error and tried to walk it back, but the damage was done. The officer asked if Linda had been using Marcus's Wi-Fi without permission. Linda's face went through another series of expressions before settling on defiant justification. She claimed that Wi-Fi signals traveled through public airspace and that she had every right to connect to any unsecured network. Marcus quickly interjected that his network had always been password protected. There was no way Linda could have connected without knowing his password. The female officer asked Linda how she had obtained the password. Linda's response was to demand to speak to the officer's supervisor and to threaten to call her lawyer. The situation escalated quickly from there. The officers requested backup. A supervisor arrived within 10 minutes, and after being briefed on the situation, he made the decision to investigate further. Linda was asked to produce her cell phone. She refused. The supervisor explained that they had probable cause to believe she had made a false emergency call and had admitted to unauthorized computer access. If she didn't cooperate, they would obtain a warrant. Linda's bravado finally cracked. She handed over her phone with shaking hands, insisting that she had done nothing wrong and that this was all a misunderstanding. The officers examined her recent call log and found exactly what they expected. A 911 call made approximately 45 minutes earlier from her number. But what they found next would transform this from a neighborhood dispute into something far more serious. While reviewing Linda's phone for evidence related to the false 911 call, the officers noticed multiple suspicious files and applications. With Linda's phone now in evidence, they requested permission to conduct a more thorough search. Linda refused, which gave them grounds to seize the device and obtain a warrant. Within hours, detectives from the department's cyber crimes unit were involved. What they discovered on Linda Pemberton's devices was staggering. Linda hadn't just been stealing Wi-Fi from Marcus. She had been stealing internet access from at least 7 different neighbors over the past 3 years, systematically obtaining their passwords through various means. In some cases, she had simply asked neighbors for their Wi-Fi passwords under the guise of needing to check something quickly, and then never stopped using their networks. In other cases, she had used password cracking software to gain access to secured networks. But the Wi-Fi theft was just the beginning. Linda had used her unauthorized network access to conduct surveillance on her neighbors. She had installed spyware applications on her devices that allowed her to monitor network traffic, seeing what websites people visited, intercepting emails and messages sent over unsecured connections, and even accessing some neighbors' smart home devices that were connected to their networks. The detectives found thousands of screenshots, documents, and files containing information Linda had collected about her neighbors. She had assembled detailed dossiers on nearly every household in Willow Creek Estates. She knew who was having financial problems based on intercepted emails from creditors. She knew who was having marital issues based on dating app activity she had monitored. She knew about medical conditions, job searches, family disputes, and personal secrets that people assumed were private. And Linda had been using this information for years to manipulate the HOA and maintain her position of power in the neighborhood. The investigation revealed a pattern of harassment and blackmail that had been going on for years. Several neighbors who had challenged Linda's HOA presidency or opposed her decisions had mysteriously faced escalating fines and violations. One neighbor who had run against Linda in an HOA election years earlier had suddenly withdrawn from the race after Linda confronted her with knowledge of an extramarital affair, information Linda could only have obtained by monitoring the first woman's internet activity. Another neighbor who had filed complaints about Linda's overreach as HOA president had faced a sudden lawsuit from an anonymous party regarding an old business debt. The lawsuit had eventually been dropped, but not before costing the neighbor thousands in legal fees and forcing them to drop their HOA complaints. Detectives traced the lawsuit back to Linda, who had discovered the old debt through intercepted financial emails. The investigation expanded beyond the neighborhood. Detectives discovered that Linda had been using stolen internet connections to conduct other illegal activities. She had been running an elaborate identity theft scheme, using information gathered from her neighbors to open fraudulent credit accounts. She had opened credit cards in at least 5 different neighbors' names, carefully keeping the balances low enough that the victims didn't immediately notice the unfamiliar accounts on their credit reports. Linda had also been engaging in securities fraud, using insider information she had gleaned from monitoring a neighbor who worked for a publicly traded company. She had intercepted emails containing non-public information about upcoming corporate announcements and had made several profitable trades based on this illegally obtained information. The full scope of Linda Pemberton's criminal enterprise was breathtaking in its audacity and scope. What had started as a simple case of Wi-Fi theft had uncovered federal crimes including wire fraud, identity theft, securities fraud, computer crimes, and conspiracy charges. The fallout was immediate and devastating for Linda. She was arrested within a week of the initial police visit to Marcus's house. Her bail was set at $250,000 due to the flight risk and the severity of the federal charges she was facing. Her home was searched, and investigators seized multiple computers, hard drives, and filing cabinets full of printed documents containing her neighbor's personal information. The investigation made local news, and soon television crews were parked on Magnolia Drive, interviewing shocked residents who were just learning that their HOA president had been spying on them for years. Many neighbors discovered they had been victims of identity theft or fraud orchestrated by Linda. Credit monitoring services were offered to all residents of Willow Creek Estates as the full extent of the damage became clear. Linda's husband, a quiet man named Gerald who worked as an accountant and seemed to have been completely unaware of his wife's activities, filed for divorce within 2 weeks. He claimed to have had no knowledge of her crimes and cooperated fully with investigators. Their adult children released a statement through an attorney, expressing shock and distancing themselves from their mother's actions. The HOA held an emergency meeting to remove Linda from her position and elect an interim president. The meeting was packed with furious residents, demanding answers about how Linda had maintained power for so long. Several former board members admitted they had suspected Linda of wrongdoing but had been too intimidated to speak up, fearing she would retaliate. Some admitted they had known Linda was collecting information about neighbors but had assumed it was just busybody gossip, not realizing the illegal means by which she obtained this information. Marcus Thompson found himself at the center of a media circus he never wanted. News outlets called him a hero for exposing Linda's crimes, though he repeatedly stated he had simply changed his Wi-Fi password and events had unfolded from there. He did interviews with local news stations, carefully explaining how unauthorized network access was not just annoying, but a serious security threat that everyone should take seriously. His story went viral on social media, with the hashtag number Wi-Fi Karen trending for several days. People across the country shared their own HOA horror stories, though few could match the scope of Linda's criminal operation. Marcus's simple act of changing his Wi-Fi credentials had unraveled a conspiracy that had victimized dozens of people over several years. The legal proceedings moved forward with remarkable speed given the mountain of evidence. Linda's attorney initially tried to negotiate a plea deal, but federal prosecutors were unwilling to offer significant leniency given the breadth and duration of her crimes. The identity theft charges alone carried potential sentences of up to 15 years, and the securities fraud added additional decades to her potential prison time. The trial, when it finally occurred 8 months later, lasted 3 weeks. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence of Linda's crimes, including testimony from more than 20 victims who had been defrauded or blackmailed. The defense's strategy seemed to be painting Linda as a lonely woman who had made poor decisions out of a misguided attempt to protect her neighborhood, but this narrative crumbled under the weight of evidence showing calculated, premeditated crimes conducted over multiple years. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Linda Pemberton, the woman who had spent years positioning herself as the guardian of neighborhood standards and community values, was convicted of 18 federal felonies. At her sentencing hearing 2 months later, the judge noted the calculated nature of her crimes and the betrayal of trust from her position as HOA president. Linda was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison and ordered to pay restitution totaling more than $400,000 to her victims. The impact on Willow Creek Estates was profound and lasting. The HOA underwent a complete restructuring, implementing new bylaws that limited the president's term to 2 years, with term limits preventing anyone from serving more than 6 years total. They established oversight committees and transparency requirements that would have made Linda's abuses impossible. Several residents who had been living under the cloud of Linda's blackmail came forward with their stories, and the community rallied to support them. Marcus Thompson settled back into his quiet life, though he became something of a legend in the community. His simple act of changing his Wi-Fi password had exposed a criminal conspiracy and brought justice to a woman who had terrorized her neighbors under the guise of community service. He was approached by cybersecurity companies offering jobs, by true crime podcasters wanting to tell his story, and by countless neighbors wanting to thank him for finally ending Linda's reign of terror. The story became a cautionary tale, taught in law enforcement training about how seemingly minor crimes can be indicators of larger criminal activity. It was discussed in cybersecurity conferences as an example of why network security matters even in residential settings, and it spread across the internet as a viral story of justice served, proof that sometimes karma arrives in the most unexpected ways. For Marcus, life gradually returned to normal. He still worked from home, still enjoyed his corner lot property, and still kept to himself for the most part. But he made sure to use a strong, unique password for his Wi-Fi network, and he changed it every 3 months. He also became friendly with several neighbors who had been fellow victims of Linda's schemes, forming genuine connections in a community that was finally free from the woman who had held it hostage for so long. The whole incident had started with something as simple as a Wi-Fi password change, but it had ended with justice being served and an entire community being freed from years of manipulation and crime. Sometimes, Marcus reflected. The smallest actions have the biggest consequences. And sometimes, the people who claim to be protecting you are the ones you need protection from. Linda Pemberton's story became a reminder that positions of power, even small ones like an HOA presidency, could be abused in devastating ways. And it served as a testament to the fact that criminals, no matter how careful they think they are being, eventually make a mistake that brings their house of cards tumbling down. In Linda's case, that mistake was underestimating a software engineer who knew how to check his router logs and wasn't afraid to stand up to a bully who had terrorized an entire neighborhood. The Willow Creek Estates community never forgot the lessons learned from the Linda Pemberton affair. And Marcus Thompson never forgot that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply protect your own digital security and stand up for what's right, even when facing down someone who seems untouchable.